Hello, everyone. Thank you for having joined us in this another Network Friday episode led by, organized by the AIR Center, that in his mission is to put together people to create, to foster new collaborations. And of course, this is also true in the case of this and this session, thematic session on sensors, where we have a panelist from the two sides of the ocean, of the Atlantic Ocean, and from the north and the south. So thank you so much. I'm really very happy to be able to chair this this session. I'm especially interested because I'm Elisa Ravagnan from the Norwegian Research Center based in Norway. And my background is in environmental science. I have more than 2 decades of experience in environmental statistics, environmental modeling, and working with interdisciplinary projects. So I would define myself as a user of the data. I'm also co-leading the Nordic in Center of Excellence in Aquatic Production, Chiraqua, and the newly appointed Age 2020 Astral, All Atlantic Ocean, Profitable, Resilient, and Sustainable Aquaculture. As I said, I'm one of the users of the data, so I'm really very honored to moderate this session where the sensor and so the data acquisition is in focus. And we have 4 great panelists with us. So Matthew Mowlem from the National Oceanographic Center, UK, Frank Muller-Karger from University of South Florida, and also MBON from USA, Eric Delory from PLOCAN, the oceanographic platform in Gran Canaria, and Marcelo Pias from the Federal University Rio Grande, Brazil. Just as introduction, it's why this session on sensors, because the ocean is, and especially sensors on the ocean is really very important for all of us. It's covering 70% of our planet, and the benefit that we have from it, both monetary and well-being, are extremely high. Monetarily is the 7th, is equiparable to the 7th economy in the world. So, but is also a fragile environment, is subject to stress and stressors. So we need to understand it better, and we need also we need to monitor it better. We need to understand it better to be able to manage in the proper and sustainable way, especially now that we are in the decade for the decade of the ocean. Declared by the United Nations. I don't think I would like to say more as introduction. I think the panelists will cover 4 different aspects of sensor technology, how to try to understand and monitor our oceans. Actually, we are talking about the networking, so putting people together. The Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission is suggesting not to use oceans as plural, but ocean as singular, just to demonstrate how we are all connected by ocean and by water. So I would like to leave the floor to our first speaker. That is Matthew Mowlem. Matthew has 2 decades of, is head of the Ocean Technology and Engineering Group at the National Oceanographic Center, as I said, in UK, has 2 decades of experience in sensors and sensor technology, has led a very large number of big projects and international projects, European and also international level. So I don't think you will see his full biography in the invitation of the session. I think it's more important to listen to his presentation. So thank you, Matthew. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elisa. That's very kind of you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so you should see that now. Okay, so it's a delight to be able to speak to you all. And it's fantastic that so many of you have been able to join online in these difficult times. I'm going to give you a very, very quick 20-minute overview of some sensors and instrumentation for some of these hard to measure variables in the marine system. Okay, so there's a well-established need for measurement, and many of you are engaged in this activity of corralling that need into an organized state through things like the Global Ocean Observing System and other attempts to try and really understand and collate that need in a better way, including the need from industry and stakeholders in aquaculture and further inland, actually. So much of this technology also is applicable in industrial water and in inland waterways. But in the ocean, many of you are very involved with this. The need has been boiled down to a list of essential ocean variables, largely through the framework of ocean observing, which has been really pivotal in creating some priorities for people like me who develop sensors. So looking at what really will make the most impact to stakeholders and to science if we could measure it. Now, much of that assessment has been based on measurements that could be made from very capable research vessels and ships, and with sampling, which is fantastic and delivers a huge amount of data and depth of understanding in complex processes. But actually, as we move forward, there is a move towards less reliance on ships and more reliance on lower carbon input technologies and technologies that can deliver larger data sets in terms of space and time. Things like autonomy, which can travel long distances from shore potentially, reducing carbon cost of collecting a huge amount of data. And obviously many of you be aware of things like the Argo float program, been very, very successful. And that's now being extended to the BioArgo program, which is incorporating biological and chemical sensors into Argo floats. So here's the list that gets generated from that process, the essential ocean variables. I'm not going to talk a lot today about the physics. I'm going to focus on biogeochemistry and the biology. And I'm going to focus on the areas that need development if we're to do this without taking a sample and without having a ship support. Now, a number of those variables get used in marine models, and those marine models get used to create information products by organizations like Copernicus. So ERSEM and the Bambi models underpin a number of those products, information products, and you can see that they've got some similarities. You know, there's a inorganic nutrients and carbon component. There's a particulates and dissolved organic matter component, and then a biological component or components. And so those really enable us to get a handle on the sort of primary productivity and energy flows within the marine environment. And also increasingly, there's now a link between these and other models. So stock models, fisheries models, here's one as an example. And you can see that that is pulling in, and actually this particular one pulls in data directly from ERSEM, so model data directly from ERSEM. And all of these models need primary data to calibrate and validate them, and in processes and in certain areas generate a lot of data so that we can get accurate parameterizations to advance the models. So that's really what we're focused at. Now, if you look at the essential ocean variables and you think about which ones can be readily measured from small autonomy, the sort of modern autonomy like gliders and surface vehicles, really we'd like to be able to measure all of those variables, at least included in the models, if not all of the essential ocean variables from small platforms. And this slide attempts to say how close we are to doing that. And actually, at the moment, we're still a little way off. There's a number of things that are red that we really can't do from small and mobile autonomy, and a number of things that are, you know, amberish in the heat map can be done with specialist instrumentation, but aren't really done in a widespread or routine manner. Oxygen is the example where we have managed to get the technology good enough, and a number of people are making excellent uses of things like fluorescent optosensors. Now, I haven't got time to talk through all of the technologies that address all of these gaps, but I'm going to talk about some examples of things that, that I've been working on with colleagues around the world. Okay, so this is a big problem. A number of amber and reds there. I'm lucky enough to work within this team, which is the Ocean Technology and Engineering Group at the Oceanography Centre in Southampton, the National Oceanography Centre. But equally, I'm engaged with excellent colleagues around the globe tackling this problem. We all are, which is a really fantastic community addressing this problem. One of the international projects just started, or just about to start, if we can get the contracting through the European Commission, is a new European project called Tech Oceans. These are the partners, and here are the essential ocean variables that we just talked about, and the technologies across the top that map onto those. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can see that within this project, will be covering pretty much all of the essential ocean variables. There are a couple of gaps. I think we manage about 68% of the primary list of the essential ocean variables, but we certainly measure all of the variables that are included, or it will be measuring with the new sensors, variables that are included in those models that I just talked about. Okay, so there's everything here from using artificial intelligence to process images from cameras and the underwater vision profiler from CNRS and Sorbonne University, through to using lab-on-chip technologies, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and ecogenomics as well. So I'm going to introduce some of those technologies. I haven't got time to go through all of them. If you want more information, it'll be coming out soon on the web, and you can always ask me. Okay, so microfluidic sensors. Now, I came from a pure optics background, and I was very unkeen on microfluidic sensors, which were being used, in fact, reagent-based sensors that were being used in oceanography when I first started this back in the early 2000s. But the power of microfluidics is that you can use laboratory assays to make high quality measurements with reagents. You can get very good specificity, very good sensitivity, and actually you can carry onboard standards to allow you to do calibration in situ. And I first thought, well, this is all going to biofoul and fur up within minutes in the marine environment, but actually we have found that isn't true. And because the volumes processed are very low, and we can do some things like filtering on inlets, actually microfluidic devices can last for very long times in the environment. Sampling the seawater, mixing it with some chemicals, and observing typically an optical response. And that's a powerful technique because it can be applied to a number of different assays, and then you can measure a large number of EOVs with one engineered platform. There are subtle differences between versions to measure different parameters, but that's the basic technique. And so recently, taking that technique through to a logical endpoint, we've got a couple of projects funded by the UK looking at operationalizing. So this is very high technology readiness level. This means that these sensors have got to be ready for the national community to use in operational science. The high TRL sensors for, well, you can see a slew of nutrients there. And we've actually got all 7 of those packed into the nose of AutoSub Long Range, which is a shore launchable AUV, autonomous underwater vehicle. There's 7 of those sensors integrated in the nose. We've recently had a very successful initial trials in Loch Ness. So here are the sensors, these are the methods, and this is the sort of limits of detection or precision. And you'll see that actually these are limits of detection mostly. The performance is very good. It's as good, if not better, than you would achieve in the lab. And we have deployed these sensors for over a year in places like under the ice near Svalbard, as part of the FIXO3 TNA, which was a fantastic opportunity for us. A year's worth of lovely data, ice covered and not, over a year. They've been deployed in tropical settings with high fouling, and they've also been deployed in things like proglacial melt streams, where there are chunks of ice, rocks and boulders flowing down. So really quite robust, and you're getting this really fantastic performance. So here's some data actually doing this on autonomy. Here is measuring nitrate from a Kongsberg sea glider, and the biogeochemist amongst you might start to see the surface drawdown of nitrate as we transition, and there's a bloom event. This has now been published some time ago by Vincent et al. But we've recently been doing deployments around the globe. Here's some just off South Africa as part of the Solstice project. Again, this is nitrate. Here's some data here, which is phosphate, so different nutrients. And here you can see some interesting features about benthic sources of phosphate making their way up into the water column. So this is all really great data. Now here are carbonate sensors. So these are measuring pH, total alkalinity and BIC, again with really good analytical performance, good enough to do some very interesting science and to provide data for models and stakeholders. So really going well. And they're currently quite high TRL. Again, they're part of this capital program in the UK to get them operationalized. We recently used those sensors to investigate whether you could detect if a carbon capture and storage reservoir of CO2, so this is carbon capture and storage technologies, whether if that leaked, would we be able to detect it on the seabed? And so we did a simulated release as part of the STEM CCS European project. I can't go into all the details of all the technology, but we had a lot of different technologies deployed to see if this could be done. But I guess this is a nice result from that, and it shows using pH, converting that into DIC, that as the tide changes with these, and the plume sweeps across the sensors, you see these defined dips in pH associated with that CO2 signal. And actually we found that operationally you can measure CO2 leakage very accurately with sensor technology. Okay, so returning now to the biological and ecosystem variables, that's much harder, right? The technology is less mature. There are systems that measure it, but not routinely and not from small autonomy. Sampling and imaging, of course, is a different story, but sensing, really quite immature. So here's a couple of technologies that we'll be developing, are developing. One is a microcytometer that passes particles, passes a sample down a very small channel in a glass chip. Here you see it held between finger and thumb. Small channels, typically 80, 100 microns wide. And in that, we can measure the optical properties of single particles as well as their impedance, so their electrical impedance, which gives you information about their cell size or the capacitance of their cell membrane or conductivity of their cytosol. So you get quite a lot of information depending which frequency you look at. And you can use that information to separate out different taxonomic groups. It's hard to do species, we're working on that, but you can certainly separate out taxonomic groups. And interestingly, you get a very clear signature from microplastics because they obviously have a very different impedance signature and optical signature to detritus and living cells. And so that's the kind of thing that we'll be working on more in Tech Oceans to try and develop that for both phytoplankton and for microplastics. Like a number of other people, we're very interested in eDNA. So using the free DNA coming from organisms to try and get a handle on what biology has been or is present in the water. And this is a it's complicated to do in the lab, but actually with some of the new robust molecular assays, you can start to do this in some very challenging environments from surprisingly simple technologies. Doing it repeatedly is more complicated, but we're working with colleagues in Japan and the US and this new European project Tech Oceans to try and make that operational. Here's some example technology. Many of you will be aware of Chris Scholin's ESP and the new version of that. And here is, this is actually a sampler that we've developed that samples eDNA. We are working as part of Tech Oceans to convert that into a sensor that can give you data on eDNA in real time from the environment of autonomous vehicles. So that's as much time as I've got to talk through the technologies, but we're very keen on working internationally. It's always amazing what we can learn. You know, there's a number of examples that we've done recently, including putting sensors onto the seabed in Belize to look at ocean acidification. We've been working with a number of small islands, developing states. We've got strong links with Bangladesh, for example, looking at their aquaculture industry and salt intrusion there. But there's lots of opportunities for collaboration, I feel, in technology development, looking at applications, doing some demonstrations, and even looking at technology transfer and supply of some of these technologies commercially. So that is a very whistle-stop tour of some things that I and other colleagues have been up to, developing sensors and instrumentation for biogeochemical, biological, and ecosystem variables. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Wonderful presentation. And actually, you are also in perfectly in time. You saved a couple of minutes. So I would remember to the I would like to remember to the people that are listening to this to the talks. They can ask a question through the bottom Q&A in the bottom bar. And we will take all the questions at the end when the panelists have finished presenting. Please, if you have a specific question to one of the panelists, write who you would like to ask the question. Otherwise, I will keep the question open for all four. At this point, I think we can go ahead with Frank Muller-Karger. So if let's take all the question afterwards. So Frank is a biological oceanographer that has interest in research and diversity of life in the sea. Factors that drive diversity and production and how they are relevant to people. Is, as I said, is working at the University of South Florida, but is also the co-chair of the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, MBON, of the MBON, and is involved also in the UNESCO Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission for the Global Ocean Observing System, GOOS, Bioeco Panel. You can see his full biography in the invitation, and I would not lose any other moment to listen to his talk about the linking essential ocean variables and essential biodiversity variable to understand life in the sea. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Elisa, and hello, everybody. Just to verify, Elisa, can you tell me if you see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay,
presentation.
Very good. Yeah, great. Matt's presentation was really a great introduction to some of the things I'm talking about here. I'm going to make a link between what he brought up, these essential ocean variables, and the essential biodiversity variables, and the kind of framework that we're developing for people to use this. So one of the objectives that we have is that people use these, what we call frameworks, the essential ocean variables and the essential biodiversity variables, as a place where you can learn and develop community, develop best practices, and work with data in a way that we can all eventually compare them. So one of the limitations, and Matt brought this up before quite nicely, is that the technologies that we have to measure life in the sea are really not quite there, and that's a challenge, and that's hopefully something that we can develop and also bring down the cost. So there's very little question in everybody's mind, although we don't think about it every day, that really good information about life in general, the crops that we use, the fish that we eat, the type of water quality and what organisms are maybe changing that water quality is really critical in terms of the health of the environment and how we use these ecosystems. So huge investments have now gone into ocean observing systems, but because the technology is more ready, we have focused a lot for decades now on physical variables, so salinity, temperature, and so on. We have now started to come up the curve on biogeochemical variables, and that's great, and we're still behind on the biological variables. So these are time-consuming efforts. In many cases, we still have to do it manually, which is great. I mean, there's a lot of jobs that could be had if we can focus people on measuring life in the sea. The thing is that we all do it a little bit differently. So we have to really characterize how things are changing and how they're changing around the world. We need to have better standards and best practices. So today we get global pictures of the biology of the planet with satellites. That's probably the best way that we can get a near daily, weekly representation of how the life of this planet is changing. Yet, of course, we know that the satellites look at the surface of the ocean. We would like to get a more three-dimensional picture of what's happening all the way down to the bottom of the sea. But here you can see that the patterns that we have in the middle of the ocean are basically the typical gyre, where you have lower chlorophyll concentration, and going toward the margins of the ocean, you have higher turbidity or higher concentrations of chlorophyll. But chlorophyll is an indicator. It's not a perfect measure of biomass, and it really doesn't tell us anything about the diversity of life. And so we need to really go beyond that. We know that the quality of food, the quality of the productivity, the amount of productivity, the way that biogeochemical cycles work is not just a function of carbon. It's a function of biodiversity. Different organisms do things differently. And so we would like to know where things live. And so there's no question that we benefit from the diversity of life, from food to pharmaceuticals, to materials, recreation, and many cultures develop around some feature of marine life. And so this is what we would like to get a handle of, is how much is there out there, how much are they producing, how are they distributed, and is it changing? And yet, when we look at the public databases that we use, this is the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, or OBIS, by the way, they changed their name to have biodiversity in the name. And we go back probably 170 years in the records that they have, we still find that there's a lot of gaps in the information about life in the ocean. This is a representation of the global surface observation, so basically the upper 20 meters. And we see that there's a lot of data, or relatively good coverage, quote unquote, in some of the industrialized nations. The Atlantic is, or the North Atlantic is pretty well covered. But if you go to the middle of the ocean, to the southern hemisphere, up into the Arctic, things are not so good. And you can see that in the right-hand side graphics. If you look at the top right-hand side, you can see that there's a decrease in the number of records in OBIS going into the database over the past 5 to 10 years. So it's very hard to measure how things are changing if we don't have up-to-date records. And that's the kind of technology that we would like to bring in, or encourage people to share their data more rapidly and more openly, so that we can look at how things are changing. The same is true as if you go to the bottom of the ocean. As you go deeper, we have less and less information. If you go to the centers of the ocean, the information is poor. So we are looking okay at the surface ocean with satellites. We have more or less some coverage in coastal zones and in continental shelves, and then the rest is very hard to monitor. Okay, so the thing here is, how do we look at change? And so The strategies that we're developing under the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, or MBON, working jointly with OBIS and with the Global Ocean Observing System, are strategies to develop these databases, but looking at biology and linking the biological variables with the physical and biogeochemical. So we can filter these data sets by taxonomy, space and time, and produce maps, abundance, and trends and indicators that can tell us something about how life is changing. So the information needs that we have led to this concept of essential variables. And the first one that came up was because the pressing need to understand the change of climate. So there's a number of essential climate variables that are now starting to expand and include some of the essential ocean variables and land variables, so including biological variables. So the essential climate variables are basically the gold standard, and they have to be feasible and accessible, open data, so that we can all use them to understand change. And the other two frameworks are the essential ocean variables and the essential biodiversity variables. So how these develop, they are developed in sort of parallel universes. And if you have the Global Ocean Observing System on the left-hand side of this diagram, they're developed under the sponsorship of UNESCO, under the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. So the Global Ocean Observing System has, for example, a biological bioeco panel, biology ecology panel, and they develop these the sets of variables that Matthew showed, and I'll show them again, the biological EOVs. On the right-hand side, you have the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network that lives under the Group on Earth Observations, and we're developing the essential biodiversity variables. So we need to bring these frameworks together. We don't want a proliferation of essential variable frameworks because these things are so flexible that we can accommodate a number of variables, and we can expand them to develop standards and best practices communities. And what we need to do is join the frameworks that have already been created to generate the products that all the groups that are shown here at the bottom need. So basically society. The essential biodiversity variables were proposed by Enrique Pereira in 2013 in this diagram. So the essential biodiversity variables are in the kind of middle circle that you have, where you have basically 6 classes, and they go from genetic composition, species populations, and species traits, but also higher levels, so community composition, so the groups of species, the ecosystem structure, so it's where things live, living things combined with non-living things, and ecosystem function. And function in many cases is a direct relationship to ecosystem services, or how we use the environment. So these are the variables that then feed into the indicator that other groups would use, like the Convention on Biological Diversity for the Aichi targets, or the Sustainable Development Goals. On the GOOSE side, you have these essential ocean variables, and some of them are organized basically by groups of organisms like microbes or phytoplankton, zooplankton, invertebrates, fish and turtles, birds and mammals. But you also have a sort of a habitat structure, or ecosystem structure set of variables for, at the moment, they include hard coral, macroalgae, seagrass, and mangroves. So these are not fixed in cement. These can grow, and we're looking, for example, on how to apply the same framework in the deep ocean, but also in very shallow areas. These things are very new. These frameworks have evolved over the past 20, 25 years, but this one, for example, was just published in 2018. And what we're hoping is that people can use them. In this slide, similar again to something that Matthew showed, and I want you to focus on the right-hand side, the bottom diagram, is where we are trying to link and have a collaboration between GOOSE, the Global Ocean Observing System, and groups like Blue Planet, which also lives under a GEO. GOOSE defines these variables, and they define them in spreadsheets, and they define the requirements and what exactly the definition is of what the variable is. with MBON, we try to bring the community together around best practices. Again, working with a group that's called the Ocean Best Practices System at the IOC. And so we bring people together on a research and development. We try to establish networks of people that try to measure the same things. We have a lot of capacity building activities going on. The intent is that all of the data flows into using a common standard format, which is the Darwin Core format, into databases like OBIS or GBIF, which are databases that are open and that are accessible to anyone. And through those, and some of those groups also develop tools, we can develop indicators. And then we have a feedback loop to see how we improve the requirements. This crazy spaghetti diagram tries to relate on the right-hand side the essential biodiversity variables like primary productivity or secondary production and the diversity of species in many different dimensions to the essential ocean variables. So this is just a schematic as an illustration that we can, these things are complementary. They're not competitive and they're not exclusive of each other. And so obviously, if we look at phytoplankton biomass and diversity, we can look at these many different dimensions of EBVs that are on the right-hand side. I'm gonna skip this, but the concept should be pretty obvious. So we're trying to develop a strategy where we work with groups like the Global Ocean Observing System, and this may include other groups. It just turns out that the GOOS is organized in regional alliances, and these alliances can bring together the users of data and their requirements for different regions. And we need to see and work with them to implement the biological observations along with the physical and biogeochemical observations that they're making. Basically, we're not trying to recreate anything new. We're trying to use existing infrastructure and just bring best practices and join the observing of biology and physics and chemistry. So some of the examples of what is happening now is there are groups organizing under these umbrellas to look at some of these EOVs. In this case, for example, we have macroalgae. There's another one for seagrasses. There's groups that are looking at phytoplankton. Matt mentioned devices like these. This is a flow cytobot, an imaging flow cytobot, basically a flow cytometer that can be used to develop time series of phytoplankton diversity. You also have devices that can do similar things for bigger organisms like zooplankton. This is the underwater vision profiler. We now have a very rich area of work in animal telemetry. This is an example that I got from somebody that works closely with us in MBON, Neil Hammerschlag at the University of Miami. Many people around the world are now trying to share these data in collecting data about the environment, but also the physiology of organisms. And we have the environmental DNA, a very exciting, very promising field where you take a sample of water and try to see what type of DNA is in that water, and then identify the different organisms using these different primers on the right-hand side, whether they're microbes or phytoplankton or invertebrates or vertebrates. So very, very rich area of research. And again, an area where we need to develop strong standards. Acoustics is a huge area of research. We would like to bring together people that do acoustics from ships, not only to do benthic mapping or mapping of bathymetry, but also try to do water column mapping. And if you use different frequencies from ships and moored and autonomous devices, you could, in principle, get a picture of the larger organisms that live underwater, and also get an idea of how this soundscape may be changing. And we have a wide variety of satellites developed by different nations and coordinated on their COs that give us very interesting pictures. And we're trying to develop, if you take, for example, salinity, temperature, sea surface altimetry, and chlorophyll, and bunch them together in a classification, you could start getting at biogeography in a very dynamic way. And we call those seascapes. They're publicly available through NOAA Coast Watch. All of this is something that we need to bring together in an intelligent way and in some data management format to develop indicators that are useful to either a sanctuary or a marine protected area or an integrated ecosystem assessment or some global effort like the Sustainable Development Goals. An example may be where we have here in the Florida Keys, we may have restoration efforts where we have had either the destruction of a reef because of a hurricane or just the slow demise of coral reefs, which is happening in many different places. And so people are trying to restore these reefs by planting seedlings of reefs. And so we would like to know if the diversity, not only of the reef, but of everything that lives in the reef is increasing. So we can use some of these technologies.
Frank, 4 minutes.
Thank you. There are many opportunities for capacity building here. There's going to be a lot of effort to train not only students, but also the professionals that use this type of information to have better coordination and best practices so that at least for some variables, for some of the essential variables, we have common methods so that we can compare things from one place to another, understand why local change is happening, if we can put it in a regional context, but also look at things, how they change over time in different places. So bringing down the cost of technologies is hugely important, or we will not accomplish geographic coverage, and training people is going to be very important. So under MBON, we have this program called Pole to Pole, where we have engaged many groups, especially in the Americas for now, but we'd like to do that in Africa and Asia, to have workshops where we bring some of these technologies to them. Ultimately, the opportunity we have in front of us with the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development is important. We need to take this as an opportunity to develop some of these best practices for looking at biology. Biology is really one of the reasons we look at all these other variables in the sea. And so this is a call for us to join and develop a better time series, using common methods, bringing down the cost of technologies, and help each other train the rest of the world in using them. So thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Extremely interesting. Thank you. Wonderful presentation. And you are, I'm really very impressed that you are all well on time. So yeah, congratulations also on the side. So many interesting things that yeah, I could listen for hours, but we need to keep the schedule. So now I would like to give the words to Eric Delory, that is working, is actually head of the observatory at PLOCAN, the oceanic platform of the Canary Island. Wonderful place. And Eric has 25 years of experience in research and development, not only sensors, but signal processing, instrumentation, machine learning. So a really very wide experience and wide portfolio. He is also really very in he was the coordinator of the Nexus project, that is a European project that was focusing on cost-effective sensors for the ocean variables, to detect ocean variables that we already heard so much of today, and but from autonomous platform. So please, Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elisa. Can you see and hear me? On my slides, at least?
Yes, absolutely.
Good. Thank you. So the outline is here, so that what I'm going to present is first how an observing system works, what it does, how much it costs, and how can sensors help on the coverage of essential ocean variables. You heard quite an amount of information on those variables in the past two presentations, so I will skip part of the description in my presentation on these EOVs. but then focus on how we can better support what we call fairness, that is findability, availability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of data from sensors. How can sensors help this challenge to make the data available and accessible? And then the role of research infrastructures in that landscape. So as you can see, essential ocean variables are cross-cutting, and you've seen in Frank's presentation that they are not competitive nor exclusive. They actually embrace several of other essential variables that are for climate and weather or biodiversity, and they have been defined according to several criteria. Generally common sense. We cannot measure everything. These variables are driven by requirements, that is some communities and societal interests and scientific drivers. They're rooted in reality. They must be feasible to measure those variables, how technologies can help. And so basically, this is how they are selected in the end, that is crossing feasibility and impact in order to make this feasible. So you've seen that table, so I won't go through that either. And but basically this is evolving. As you can see, there is ocean sound, which is new to some of you, I guess, as one of the essential variables. So came up in 2018 as one of the EOVs, new EOVs. And some, as you can see, well, this is very coarse, but I've put these arrows saying more or less the readiness level where we are in terms of sensor technology to measure these variables. So basically physics is pretty mature, and when you move to biogeochem, it is less, and biology and ecosystems even less. This is a coarse picture. You may have exceptions here, and just so that you keep that in mind. And I think this also is in agreement with what you've seen in the past two presentations from Matt and Frank. So I wanted to highlight what we do through our example. That is what we are doing here in the Canary Islands, because this is what I best know. And so we have an observatory, and as lots of areas where you have got the luck to have the ocean and the coastal environment where lots of variables need to be measured and the environment to be better managed, requires some infrastructure. So this is in situ installations that we have at PLOCAN, and so one is a stock that is the 24 years observations in time series, physics and biogeochemistry. Now adding biology to a broader extent. We have a test area as well for sensing technologies, but not only, also for renewable energies, aquaculture activities. So this is a 23 square kilometer area that we are using for testing technologies basically, and moving science forward in what would be edge needs at this moment, always mixing science and new technologies. So basically we use also to observe not only fixed stations like this one, which is a stock 100 kilometers north of the Gran Canaria Island. So it's in 3,600 meter water depth. And so the interest here is that it is in the oligotrophic gyre, and in the subtropical area, it exhibits open ocean characteristics. It's not directly influenced by coastal upwelling, so that is a representative fixed point observatory for an area of the open ocean. And well, it has some specificities. So like it is the site is influenced by mineral deposition from the Saharan aerosols and atmospheric dusts. And there is good comparison work taking place, and for now decades between the BATS station and the stock for study of the ecosystems and the physics. So you can see that there are more technologies than just fixed stations. On top left, this is the stock surface buoy. And on top right, you would see gliders that go back and forth from our shore areas, shore station to the open ocean station, where we also do some sampling because we need to validate our measurements for sensors, and also we need to measure things through still these types of sampling devices, rosette, because there are sensors that are just not yet ready for measuring certain variables. In particular, and despite the emerging sensing technologies like one you saw in Matt's presentation, there still needs to measure and well, to sample and measure in the lab. So ships, of course, are important, not only for maintaining the station, but also to operate this type of device. So then you can see this is a drifter that is a part of the NOAA program for measuring currents in particular. And that's very helpful. It's been there for quite an amount of time as well. And so basically all these tools allow for time series to be then fed into reports and to see how climate and biodiversity and the ocean is evolving. Now, of course, as you could see in Frank's presentation, there is a need for data to be delivered, and delivering data in good form implies that there are good tools for the users, but also tools that operators can handle. And a lot of training is needed still here. And there are lots of initiatives that are now blossoming and doing quite a good job. Besides what you could see here on the left, which is a bare threads server, that's where the tools for accessing data is not so user-friendly for the user who's not familiar with using these type of formats, but feed into other initiatives and research infrastructures like here and Zoeric. You can see Copernicus, CDataNet, and IMODNet. And those make it easier for the user to find the product. So this is how it works at this moment. And we're trying to improve on that through the use of sensor technologies now, particularly as you will see one example. But this is already work that is pretty mature and very rewarding for the ocean community. So the cost, of course, as you heard, also we need to reduce the cost. And why? Because it is already very costly to measure in the ocean, and it is just even more costly to measure from satellites. But the in-situ data is absolutely essential for ground truthing what is being measured from elsewhere. And yet the cost can't increase infinitely at the scale of the variables being needed in terms of measurements. So what we need to do, and this is just the example of our station, so it's hundreds of thousands of euros per year in operational costs, and more or less the same scale in capital expenditure, in sensors, in hardware. And so basically we're talking about €500,000 a year, roughly, for operating this one single station, which has multidisciplinary ambition in the open ocean. So some paths are here. First, to start mixing not only fixed open ocean measurements, but also use the opportunity of mobile, more cost-effective platforms in certain ways, in particular to increase the spatial coverage in areas which are poorly monitored. And then also to use new technologies to make sensors more multifunctional, lower power, more reliable, and to deliver easier access to data and reuse from the sensors to use web services technologies, in particular for real-time data. Why not use the potential of artificial intelligence? So this is an example of an ecosystem sensor using matrix fluorescence. It has been developed in the framework of the Nexus project. And so it's technology which is at prototype stage at this moment, although we have some samples and it could move into production if there were a real strong demand to these medium enterprise, which is Trias in Germany. And what this sensor does is basically using fluorescence excitation emission pairs. And basically by having 4 and 4, you get, so 4 excitation and 4 emissions, you get 16 pairs that would theoretically allow you to measure up to 16 variables, but only some pairs matching the response of a certain variable. So it goes from chromophoric dissolved organic matter to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, chlorophyll, and the like. So there are, so this is why I call them ecosystem sensors, because it's not only variables which are of interest for biologists, for example, biogeochemistry, but also contaminants. But there's still lack of commercial integration of these truly efficient anti-fouling systems that need to be installed on such sensors when you are in particular in coastal waters. This is one issue, but that's available in prototype that has been developed by Ifremer and tested on one of Trias sensors, and also the problem of market adoption at this moment for these smaller platforms, and sometimes the availability of high-end components, in particular ultraviolet LEDs. And as was mentioned earlier, ocean sound is now a cross-disciplinary essential ocean variable as well. And so this is a sensor that has some intelligence embedded that does some pre-processing. So it was developed in Nexus and reached high TRL for ocean noise measurements, but still at pretty low TRL yet for certain applications of interest to the biological community, for example, for bioacoustics, and where we are able, of course, to trigger recordings and so on, but still the analysis needs to be made on offline on such small, low power sensors at this moment. And we've starting to test them on deep gliders, and we are pretty confident that we can move forward with this type of integration in the future. And there are needs like automatic artifact removal, because machines produce noise, and where you install hydrophones and these types of sensors, which are supposedly intelligent, they have to be tested against rough conditions where you get lots of mechanical noise, whether it is mooring or whether it is a glider just going up and down with the ballast moving through the vessel. Yes, so now moving to how we connect to these sensor technologies and how we could deliver real time from machine to understand what the data and how the data was produced, and for the reuse and for the fairness, we need to be proficient in metadata. And the users and the operators of these sensors need to understand a bit at this moment still how the information flow from the sensor to the user. So this is an end-to-end chain, and this type of information needs to be collected and harvested and flowing through the chain to the data, so that you've got all the information when you get the data, and not only numbers and figures that make no sense to a scientist or anyone, or not even a machine, of course, and even less if it is a machine that needs to read the data, if the metadata is not encoded in machine understandable, machine readable language. So for these, there are some tools that we've developed, and like a friendly sensor ML editor here, where the sensor model language standard that comes from the OGC is made more easy to handle through an editor. So it's called Smiley, and you could find it through 52 North, or contact me if you want to know more about it.
4 minutes, Eric.
Okay. So that's in the end, when we are able to have these interoperability layers throughout the acquisition chain, from the sensor to the data assembly center, then we would be able to highlight all the sensors, active or not, that are acting in an area in real time. Like when you're looking at for a hotel, let's say on TripAdvisor or so, well, you would be able then, if you have a case happening somewhere, you would be able to see whether there are sensors active there and what they do and who are the people operating it. So that's findability for fairness. And so this is the backbone technology that is behind what we call the sensor web enablement technologies. And so basically based on open source technologies. So that has been tested on different ways, and sensors, both sensors and platforms are now equipped, but still, I mean, equipped at experimental level, and we are always happy to discuss with manufacturers, whether sensors or platform manufacturers, how to embed those technologies to have these services implemented. So we've done that on wave gliders, we've done that also on Auger floats, integrating new sensors that I showed earlier. And this is what you would get in the end, that is be able to locate a float here or a glider through your browser independently of the manufacturer, and see your time series here. You can see on the left a wave glider pattern collecting underwater sound and optics sensing values. This is a deep glider that is off Norway, equipped with a prototype for a hydrophone, doing some noise measurements and delivering the data nearly real time each time it surfaces. That's part of the Nexus project. And this has been implemented as well on the FairyBox. And as you can see, FairyBox is using another, well, standards that were not sensor web enabled in the end, but the sensor web technologies could easily just gather the data and make the data available through maps and these types of time series as well. So it's pretty compatible. So now I'm finishing, and basically what I would like to say is the importance of research infrastructures, and in the way we move from a certain TRL, that is technology readiness level, let's say from 5 to 8 or 9, when sensors and new platforms can make it to the market, that is to be represented through large communities in the framework of large infrastructures as well. And here is an example. This is the EMSO EGIM, where we are going now to the coastal area. This is a system that was developed for the deep ocean initially, and now it is going to migrate also to the coastal areas. And as you can see here, we're going to make this system, which is a standard European generic module, also sensor web enabled, capable, and basically, yes, this is the type of system that allows us also to test new sensors for new challenges. And this is throughout European waters at this moment, with 3 systems that have been developed and that will be made available and hopefully sure to the community. And smarter sensors for coastal observations. This is also what we've sometimes not paid full attention to. That is, the coastal waters also in need for smarter sensors, and the conditions are very hard and difficult in coastal waters, or because of the fouling, because of the challenges, the societal challenges, which are different as well. So what we will do is now integrate some of the sensors that you've seen earlier, and not only in my presentation, but on these EGIM type of sensor package. Also see how artificial intelligence can help and how sensor web services can make the real-time findability possible. And I also invite people here online to take a look at the Jericho S3, which is the umbrella that is governing basically European coastal observation and observing systems. The transnational access is open, and so basically that's free access to infrastructures with support for travel, and to go to the website jericho.ri.eu and take a look. And inviting you as well to come to our test site at PLOCAN, so be in touch and let us know your challenges, and we'll study them with you and hopefully make a change. And here are some references. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Really very interesting presentation, and especially the explanation about all the facilities and the research infrastructure that we can find around, especially in Europe. So I would like now, I see that the chat is really very alive. Remember to ask a question in the Q&A. I see that some of the question has already been answered, but we really would like to have not a one-to-one discussion, but a discussion afterwards all together. So please write your question on the Q&A, and then we can ask to all the panelists so everybody can hear the answers. Eric, if you can stop sharing. Yes, thank you. So now we are going to our last panelist, Marcelo Pias. Marcelo is assistant professor at the Federal University of Rio Grande. And he has worked a lot and studied also in UK. So he's really on his own, this connection between the two sides of the Atlantic. He's really very interested in the field of sensor systems and communications, especially wireless communication. I will not say more about Marcelo CV. You can see it on the invitation, but please, Marcelo, start your presentation about the low-cost artificial intelligence-based sensors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elisa.
You are not in the presenter mode yet. We can see all the slides. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay, so I would like to bring some perspective on the sensor development side, perhaps more my view on the technology. So I'm a computer science by training. So and I want to bring a link from the previous presentation from Eric Delory, which is the use of artificial intelligence in this in the context of a developed low-cost sensor. Okay, so it's an opportunity there. So I just want to give just a brief overview of the outline of this presentation. So I'm going to say a few words about application needs and why we developed the sensors in the way we're developing them. Then I want to just to bring some words on the sensor development cycle. So the traditional way. I want to bring some personal perspective. So I work for Intel development sensors from technology perspective. And then I want to say that maybe there is an opportunity for doing in different way this development of new sensors. And finally, just want to give an overview of this new upcoming project that we are involved, which is Astral. It's a Horizon 2020 Astral project. So before that, I just want to say a few words. So we are the Computer Science Center in southern Brazil. We do robotics, we do sensor developments and integration of sensors for doing perception. And all of this work is really embraced by machine learning. So we recently teamed up with NVIDIA Deep Learning Institute. So we are university ambassador for NVIDIA. So that means that we can bring training, deep learning training, artificial intelligence training to our students, and also that's kind of enhance our research projects. We also have one of the top 5 aquaculture facilities here in Brazil. So it's with 16 tanks. We get the water from the ocean, from the sea coast that we have here. And a lot of the things that I'm going to say is really being designed and validating this kind of scenario. So aquaculture for us on the technology development is the target application scenario. So I want to start saying a few words about the application needs in this context. And we have been talking a lot to local producers in Brazil and some of our European collaborators. Okay, so and we see that there is this kind of trend to a sort of a more eco-friendly value chain for fishery and aquaculture. Okay, and producers here, they are really keen to get some sort of green certificate or green seal. Okay, that would sort of certify their facilities as being eco-friendly. And part of their process is really looking at the technology and how they can manage the production in a better way, and how they can do things differently. Okay, and one of the things here that you should be looking at remote and unattended site monitoring, where power supply is limited to none. So that's that's sort of an issue we have for technology development. Communication is not a major problem for all this remote sites, especially if you want to do this continuous monitoring and real-time visualization of variables. So and maybe configuring some event detection as part of that process. We in all this needs, we look at some of the variables. So water quality, crop related. So we see quite a lot of biomass variables as a real challenge from the previous presentation. So it's all going under this category here. The other opportunity and need is to do some sample collection. So water sample collection for chemicals, so that you can manage fish disease and that kind of situation. But I think the opportunity for me from the technology side is that we have quite a lot of data, and we should capitalize on that data to enhance the knowledge of the local producers. So this is one of the key aspects of what we intend to do, and then what we're doing on this side here, and now with some collaboration with European partners. So predictive data modeling or forecasting is a tool that we see as something that should be explored further, especially now with the new artificial intelligence, with new machine learning techniques, and with new deep learning techniques. So very low cost intelligence sensor seems to be the way to go, and that requires low cost installation as part of that. I just want to give an overview of my experience in developing sensors in previous projects in the UK, now in Brazil, and the industry. So I would call this the traditional way. So basically what you have a situation where you take signal, and then this is the low level processing. Okay, so you take signal from the sensor can be analog or digital, then you have some raw measurement in a digital format, and do some filtering, low pass, high pass filtering. So you condition the signal in some way, and then the result of that is data. Okay, so and this is typically done on a sort of on-device situation. Okay, so then after that, you take the data, you use some software package for an analysis, cloud-based analysis, so visualization of relevant events, and automation of detecting some of these events. Okay, so this is happening in a sort of off device. So this is happening outside device. Okay, so this is the way we have seen sensors being developed, and as part of that, a major issue is sensor calibration. So we want to remove structure errors, okay, and then basically use standard reference for that. So for inertial sensors, we know that the gravity is a constant 1g, so we can calibrate accelerometers, MEMS sensors based on that. Another way is to use a more calibrated sensor, so that's more accurate. And in that respect, we'd be looking at ways of doing this calibration. Okay, so one-point calibration is the simplest, I guess, way of calibrating. So correct for a specific type of error. So it's the offset errors. Then we have two-point calibration to correct for slope and offset errors. Then we go to the multi-point curve fitting. And the reason we do that kind of calibration is that we observe that there's a non-linear behavior over the measurement range, and that non-linearity it's kind of develops over time. So if you're looking at this type of remote in situ monitoring, we would be looking at something that you would leave the systems there for some time, and that kind of drift over time becomes a major problem in sensor development. Okay, and then we, there are many ways of doing that, but I mean, just showing here, we have the input from your sensor, so you have the output, and you have the expected output. The expected output is your reference values, your ground truth, and then the difference there is the error that you have to understand and compensate. So what I'm saying here is that for this type of remote monitoring, we would be looking at a situation where the sensor output on the IOX here and the expected output or ground truth data on the x-axis here, in an ideal situation, this would be the same. So that's the sort of line you see there. But what we observe is that the actual response is nonlinear. That's the red line there. Okay, and multi-point calibration brings something that we have done here, and many other groups are developing this type of calibration, where we do the system for a particular application. So in this case, a student here, Bruna Guterres, so she's looking at using mussels as proxies for pollution. That's her project. Okay, so and she's integrating the magnetic field sensing sensors for that. Okay, so to monitor the opening and the closing of the shells of the animals, based on some of pollutants in the water. Okay, so in the sort of on the right side here of the figure, you can see that the traditional sensor development low process is happening there. So we have the sensors, some of the filtering happening there. But then at the same time, you introduce what we believe is a higher accurate system using computer vision cameras, doing the monitoring. And those systems are really synchronized. So they are synchronized down to microsecond. You can go down to nanosecond if you have very specialized systems. Okay, so then you get a situation where you have data from different systems. Okay, and from those data you can build some calibration models. And then what Bruna did here was that she developed a very simple neural network we call shallow neural network. It's 3 layers, okay? And that model now can be used as the, let's say, the mood calibration point for a sort of a longer term operation of the system, okay? So I mean, this is all good, okay? But then I want to just to say a few words about linking to the how we can use artificial intelligence in this whole scenario of sensor development. Okay, is that we can use edge-based computing or edge-based artificial intelligence. Okay, and then I'm arguing here that we can do that for sensor calibration, which is the task I just showed you, okay, and for any type of event detection. Event detection here, it seems to me that it's computing some indicators or finding some events from that data. Okay, so and the reason we can do that today is that because we have what I call the perfect storm. So we have very advanced techniques called deep neural networks on the left side. So this is lots of neurons, lots of layers, hidden layers. Okay, all of this together, they build this nice filter, okay, or this nice function from the output, from the input to the output. Okay. At the same time, people start using these specialized machines. It's it's called vector machines. GPUs, is the technology in place for computer graphics, which is now being used for training this kind of networks on the left side. Okay, and another thing that's happening is the amount of data we're collecting is increasing. So the big data. Lots of data, but also the little data, as I put it here, is important as well. Even for the scenarios of sensor monitoring. So all these three, they together they enables this new type of edge-based computing. So why this is important for this type of measurements? Because if it's a remote in situ measurement, there is opportunity for doing higher sampling frequency of our sensors. Okay, so it can collect more data. Okay, because you can process more data. So there is also image-based data, which can be collected and processed locally on the system. The previous presentations, a few presenters they mention about sound-based data, which is another type of data. But I mean, all of this thing, if you leave this unattended in a remote site, or even on a sort of a land-based agriculture facility, like you have here in Brazil, it's sort of really remote. Okay, data communication then becomes prohibitive. Okay, so it is expensive, throughput is limited. Okay, so we should be looking at onboard processing. Okay, and if you look at that for the sensor development in the future, I believe that most of this box that we see, we saw before, the sensor or measurement, the post-process features extraction, event predictions, all that kind of analysis. We have now opportunity to embed this into a sort of a GPU-based edge computer, as you see on the right side. Okay, so and having said that, one of our other students here has been working on developing classification schemes using deep learning. So what we see here, we see on the left side a data set of microalgae, 19 classes, and then on the right side we see a sort of a deep neural network, lots of inner layers. Okay, and those layers are doing lots of abstraction on the image, okay, and then in the end you classify the the specific microalgae in a sort of one of the 19 classes. Okay, this is a sort of a classification problem that, but I mean, we today with the technology with this edge computing, we can actually embed this type of deep neural network, okay, inside our end system. Okay,
3 minutes, Marcelo.
Okay, so the low cost visual-based sensors that I'm just mentioned. Okay, so it's really embedded this AI deep learning models into affordable GPUs. So the one I just showed you is it's one of the we have been working here is an NVIDIA Jetson Nano. So it costs under $99. Okay, so we see that the cost now can be lower because we are using existing technology for one specific application, graphics. Now we're using for analysis and high performance computing. Okay, so the processing of this is allows you to do multiple operations on the same data. Okay, this is very specific for the type of transformations you would need in a sort of in these models. Okay, I mean the detection of microparticles, camera resolution, and the issues of how to take a picture in water fluid. I mean, this is all the design issues that you have to now to address if you are really looking at this type of application. Okay, so I saw a lot of in the previous presentation, the biomass kind of detection, and I see a lot of opportunities for that. So in the end, I think the vision here is really to create a library of pre-trained deep learning models for detecting microplastic, HABs, and so forth. Okay, and we can do quite a lot of this analysis today using off-the-shelf cameras. I mean, the latest Galaxy S20 comes with a higher resolution camera. Okay, so there are some early results showing that detection of particles at the micrometer level for that kind of stuff. Okay. So finally, I just want to mention that we are really excited to be starting a research project. Okay, so this is a Horizon 2020 project called Astral, and it's looking at to develop new sustainable and profitable resilient value chains for multi-trophic agriculture, so the IMTA production. Okay, so it's we are kind of covered the most of the continents. So we have people in Europe, Nigeria, so South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, and as part of that, my involvement is looking at the technology pool. So we have really experienced partners: NORCE, Leita, EGM, Biodiversity from France, SAMS from Scotland, FURG, and CSR from South Africa. And this side here, we'll be looking at developing new sensors, perhaps using this approach that I just mentioned, and also looking at low-cost IoT kits for aquaculture. So this is really integrated. So some existing sensors, doing some development of vision sensors, and everything will be integrated in a sort of analytics platform. I mean, this is the sort of overview of what I have for today, and I think it's kind of linking to to the previous presentation in some way. Yes, this is my presentation today.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you. I see, and that in the chat, a lot of questions are being asked, answered, and so on. That's really very good. This is the purpose of the Networking Fridays, to put people together to talk about a common interest and to foster collaborations. So I have some question that has not been answered, not been asked and answered. So first, about to a specific question to Matt. You were talking about the plastic sensor. I mean, sensor that can also detect the plastic. And if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, and especially if you can only separate between live animals, so cells and plastic, or if you can also identify different type of plastic with these sensors.
Okay, so certainly for the sampler that I mentioned, then the laboratory analysis would enable you to do separation of plastic types using things like FTIR spectroscopy. I am not expecting the impedance spectroscopy to make a difference between different types of plastic. So that would be separating out detritus from live dead and plastics. However, that instrument does also include a number of optical channels, and that is one of the research angles that we're looking at to see what we could do optically to separate out different types of plastic. And there is also the potential of doing some reagent-based or processing of the sample to enable you to do some discrimination. So there are some dyes, for example, that preferentially bind to certain types of plastic, and that could make it an easier job rather than having to do, say, Raman spectroscopy or FTIR spectroscopy in situ. So it's a developing area. Currently, I would imagine sizing and separation is the first thing to prove to do, and then we can move on to doing some of the more complicated analysis. Other people are looking at things like Raman and FTIR in situ, and simple color, actually, in some wavelengths. Simple spectroscopy can reveal a lot of information. Other people are doing that. So a developing field, and we'll be tackling it as part of the project we've just got funded.
Thank you. Really very interesting, definitely. And I really like this connection you have with the future. And I would like to link it to another question. And I would like to ask all the panelists actually to answer, because you have, as we say before, 4 different point of view in a way you brought to the table for different aspects on the sensor and sensing technology. What is your idea about the future? What do you think is the short and medium term we could expect with this in this field that is booming as it is, the sensor technology? So not to put always Matt on the spot, maybe Frank want to start this time?
You can put Matt on the spot anytime. I think that there, as you say, there's a lot of excitement and a lot of groups that are coming together around the idea that we need to understand life in the sea and in the context of measuring physics and chemistry at the same time, but also how it fits in the socioeconomic structure. And as we go through all the problems that we have right now, it's become more obvious than ever that things are not easy. They're not easy for a lot of people. And there's a lot of hope that the ocean can bring some solutions to some of the hunger and issues with having jobs and so on. So I think that there's a lot of hope in this business of the blue economy if we organize it right. It is not going to be automatic. It's not going to be instantaneous. It's going to take a lot of coordination between different groups. And I think everybody that is connected right now seems to be willing to participate in a dialogue to do that. And so hope that we don't just hang up and everybody goes away and the dialogue dies out. So I think that the Air Center can help us come together around some of these issues. The issues are, it's not simply putting sensors in an area like Africa and everything is solved. I mean, this has to be connected to a business strategy. It has to be connected to jobs. And there's a reality that a lot of this technology takes effort to maintain and some skill. And so not everything is going to work everywhere. And we've tried that before. We can put some sensors someplace and within a couple of years, they are out of repair or not calibrated. So we need to think of this through. There's a lot of issues that we talked about that can be solved with perhaps low-tech technologies, but more jobs. So you can involve people. if it addresses a specific socioeconomic need. But so there's another group that we're involved in that was kind of an outcome of this conference that we call the Oceanops 19 that happened last year. It's a group that is trying to connect ocean observing to businesses, specifically starting in Africa. We're looking for businesses that would be interested in having ocean observations, and those businesses can then outline a business model and work with the local government so that there are investments in local jobs. If there's no investment in local jobs, we can do all the capacity building we want, and all it leads is to brain drain. And so I'm very worried about that. I don't think that we have maybe somebody else does, but a ready-made strategy for between now and 2030. It will take dialogue and working with very different groups. And so I welcome this opportunity to start that.
The co-creation, the famous co-creation that is mentioned several times, but then is really very difficult to put in place. Eric, would you like to be the second to answer this question about the future? What do you see?
So I've got my ideas on that too, and probably this is a subset, but I think data science, for example, can help as well for those variables that we can't measure using proxies. This is being starts to be developed now for Argo measurements used for then ecosystem assessments of certain components that can't yet be measured in the field in such coverage that Argo would allow for, because the floats are very constrained. And so only a few sensors can be installed on these floats at this moment. So basically, yes, data science coming from programs like Argo, and see how we can correlate physical variables with ecosystem assessment or conditions. Then the second would be the increasing number of mobile platform technologies, and this also calls for smaller and lower power sensors, and more reliability as well of the measurements. So as we know, lots of sensors drift, and so in the end, working on these three aspects all together, I think is important. So going so that we can use these, well, in particular, gliders are exceptional vehicles at this moment. Still, also some improvements need to be made there. They're still too expensive, I think, for certain local communities to acquire them. And you need a pilot behind them, but this creates jobs, as Frank said earlier. And so that's not so costly in a way if you create a job position behind each glider that really serves a purpose. So I think this, yes, this is a second aspect. And then, and that is related, is to involve local communities as much as we can, because you can't count only on certain rich countries that can afford new technologies to cover the whole ocean, always, in particular in coastal areas where lots of challenges are taking place, and pollution in particular, or aquaculture or fisheries can be affected. And so there you need to count on the local populations, and they need to be equipped in a way, or at least trained. And low-cost technologies in particular can help, even if you don't get the high accuracy data that scientists need. So sometimes it's not a necessity.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a trade-off between automizing and technology advancement, and still keeping a job, especially for the local communities. Matt, would you like to answer this question?
I'll try and keep it brief, but yes, I think the future looks pretty good in the near term. I think we're going to see the availability of some sensor technologies that can make a lot of these measurements from the smaller platforms. Not all of them, you know, the biological variables and the complexity required in some of those models is quite deep, and so that will take some time. But certainly, many of the chemical and physical parameters will be measured routinely by sensor technologies, or could be measured routinely by sensor technologies. In the near future, they are still going to be relatively costly, you know, tens of thousands and thousands of dollars type of range. But over time, I expect those costs to fall if we can expand the market beyond marine. So if the sensors can also find application in, say, terrestrial water monitoring, then the volume at which they can be produced goes up and the cost will come down. Other sensors in the portfolio may become cheaper anyway, just by the nature of the methods that are now being used, modern methods, things like mass fabrication, that may enable the costs to come down. I mean, if the iPhone was produced in the volumes that oceanographic instruments were used in, it would be an awful lot more expensive than it is. And so some of those scaling fabrication technologies can be used for instrumentation. So I think that will enable more opportunistic deployment of sensors, putting them on things like navigation marks, fishing nets, on vessels that aren't scientific. I think that will grow in scale as the cost comes down. You can do all of these things now, but the cost is prohibitive, really. So that's the sort of more medium to long-term future, I hope.
Yeah, thank you. And I really liked your idea. Of course, the sensor have to go down in cost, and the more we produce, the more we go down in cost. But I also want to link with what Frank was saying. Yes, but we should have a sort of coordination of what we are deploying. So this networking of deployment and observation should be connected. So we don't have only spot the local reality that could be interesting, but actually we could put the data together. I will have another question about the data afterwards. Marcelo.
Okay, so yeah, I just want to add that the local community, I think they require low-cost technology. Maybe that's not for the science paper, but for the way of producing their crops and things like that. So I think that the role of low-cost technology, and I want to bring the issue of economy of scaling here. And I think that most of the systems that I see in this area is highly specialized, highly customized, and I think there's an opportunity here to capitalize on the existing systems from other areas, from this from this industry where they produce volumes of systems. Okay, and I think that's where you see the low cost. Take some advantage for us here, and in that respect, I see that the role of artificial intelligence as a way for us to analyze first existing data, so build models from the existing data, and also a way of, as I mentioned before, to produce, bring this intelligence into the sensor system. Okay, and when I say intelligence here, one of the things that we are working locally here is where we give producers a small kit of IoT sensors, interconnect sensor, and we have an app, and then that helps them to to look at their their variables. Of course there are still physical and chemical variables, So the basic set that was mentioned before. Okay, but I mean we can add intelligence to the context. Okay, and so that the app then gives a number to the local producer. I think there is an opportunity for reaching those kind of communities, and the project that's about to start, Astral, is really looking at the value chains around that. So how we can boost those kind of chains and economies, and of course that's going to increase production, and at the same time keeping the way they produce in a sort of complying with some of the greener activities. So this is the way I see. I see a future where most of the technology can capitalize on image sensors, and we can capitalize on other industries, as I mentioned. So there's quite a lot of work on imaging, and I think image can do a lot of detections for us. So going down now to the cameras that we have, we can go down to micro level. So biomass, lots of things that today they are kind of blurred, how to detect, or how to I think we can capitalize on those systems. This is the way I see it.
Thank you, Marcelo. Another question that is connected with this local community and so on that we are having in the queue is like Andrea is asking, I would like to know how we can use sensor to improve rudimental fishery in Africa. I know that Frank has already answered partly into this question, but this is exactly a practical question about how we can use the sensor not only for, of course, the big observation system, understanding the ecosystem and so on, but practically. I don't know, Eric, would you like to start with this one?
I was answering another one, so I didn't listen to yours. I'm sorry,
Okay.
Can you repeat that one?
So you see, this is the multitasking that is failing. Andrea would like to know how we can use sensor to improve rudimental fishing in Africa, for example. As an example, so how we can use the sensor for really very practical problems.
Okay, so yeah, chlorophyll I would say is generally, but there maybe Frank would tell us more about it, because this is really related to the trophic chain. But yeah, chlorophyll sensors are so based on fluorescence, or other even satellite imaging can help you identify areas basically where you would find most fish of your interest in your area. And generally this is quite well identified in terms of patterns when you look at satellite pictures where there is upwelling, for example, occurring in certain African coasts.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, basically this is what I would say, and making sure that the waters where you are fishing have not lost their oxygen content, basically because of eutrophication. But so yes, I would say oxygen and chlorophyll could be one of the two. These two sensors I would have if as a priority, yeah, to identify the areas of highest probability. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and then I really like the suggestion that Frank made in the online question and answer about having the Air Center as a focus for this collaboration between the need and the providers of possible technology that can be useful for the problem. I have two questions, especially for Matthew, but I think they are also in general. So first is that your sensor use energy harvesting technologies. This is the first question, and I will ask you also the second one. So the sensor are the sensor proprietary, sorry, or the technology is open to be replicated in other countries or like Africa or so on?
Okay, so I'll take the first one first, which is around energy harvesting. So the sensors themselves don't currently do energy harvesting. However, we are looking at, so one of the challenges with very long-term sensing over large areas is energy consumption, particularly with things like the microbial and genomic measurements using eDNA. In the laboratory, you'd run quite large volumes of water through usually a filter to pre-concentrate, and that's quite energetic. Takes quite a lot of battery power to do it. So we have been looking at ways of going to, say, surface vehicles that can collect energy from the environment as they go along to enable you to do some of those higher energy analyses over time. And that does look quite promising. For most other applications, we find it's more efficient just to carry more batteries. The energy that you generate from your energy harvesting over the time window that the sensors operate tends to suggest dollar for dollar and kilogram for kilogram, it's better to just carry more batteries. And so that tends to be what we do. But that's not true for those sort of high power sensor systems that I just talked about. In terms of proprietary nature of the sensors, so I think this is a challenge, right? There's two ways that you can go, and it depends. Currently, most of the people that we collaborate with, the intellectual property is retained so that commercial companies will be interested in producing them at scale and hence drive the cost down, as I just spoke about. However, for some of the more simple sensors, we have got collaborations where it is feasible that people not involved with their development or specialist manufacturers would be able to manufacture them without extensive knowledge transfer projects, and then open source might well be the way to go. But the ones that I've just shown, they're sufficiently complicated that we think we need to have a company producing them under license, and therefore they're proprietary at this stage. So a little bit it depends, and some technologies will be open source, and we have open source projects, but many of them will not be because of the drive to get them commercialized.
Yeah, thank you. That's really very, very interesting. I think it's important to define open sources all the time could be a danger towards the quality. So we need to be a little bit careful with that. And then a question that is not say who, but I think it's should be more directed to Marcelo. We have a student that I'm postgraduate students, a doctorate, I work on research on reliability of sensor data using an artificial intelligence technique. And Felipe so is wondering if this type of approach can contribute in projects or when they're working on those type of data.
That's a very good question. So I think reliability of these systems it's a crucial factor, because especially if you leave the systems unattended for some time. So so this is where I see this opportunity for using machine learning models as a way to out-calibrate the system. So that means you monitor the behavior of the system, so you continuously then readapt and calibrate the data you are generating. So yes, there is definitely a huge space for doing out-calibration of sensor systems using artificial intelligence, specific machine learning. So and I think that the issue of reliability it's also connected to another question, which is how can you trust the data? Basically, that was the question. Okay, and there is a point where you get the data and maybe you don't know exactly the accuracy of the data that at that time. Okay, so this is why I think that on the sensor development side, if you if you embrace the calibration using this mood point calibration, this machine learning models, I think of course these models, they are built and trained using lots of previous data. Okay, so that's the idea of the machine learning approach, and I think that can help a lot the calibration of sensors and improve the sort of accuracy of the data that we're collecting over time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are almost closing, but Frank would like to answer one of the questions about how to monitor the coastal zone for areas, so the countries that, of course, they are developing and don't have the amount of money it can have other countries availability.
Yeah, I don't think we have time to go deeply into this. So obviously, that's a very complicated question. In many cases, it's just a matter of overuse of resources. Eric mentioned the issue of pollution or eutrophication, and it really will depend on every situation. Every situation is different. In many cases, you have simply an abuse of the resource, and foreign companies that come and basically buy the resource off of the dock and take it illegally. So there's an enforcement issue, there's an education issue, it's a technology issue. Ultimately, if the local community doesn't benefit from everything that we're talking about here in a positive way, they will continue to overuse the resource and do things that they shouldn't do to conserve the resource for future generations. So this is almost like you have to go through each problem one at a time and try to find solutions that fit the local community.
Thank you, Frank. I totally agree with you. I really like your how you frame the answer. I don't think we have time to answer more questions, but Jose will make sure that the panelists will answer the question you have already put in the system, and you can also add additional question, ask additional question to send to him, and he will take care of he will have the answer from the panelists for sure. So I would like to thank you again, all our panelists for today. A very wonderful discussion, very wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And I can see there are a lot of people thanking you also in the chat. So it's not only me. I would like also to thank you, the Air Center, for organizing this special session on sensors. Jose Luis Montinho is the head behind all those Networking Friday, and this session also has been organized with the collaboration of Patricia Lopez Garcia from the National Oceanographic Center. Please answer her survey questionnaire that you see that you received in the invitation, and please continue to follow Air Center and this Networking Fridays, because a lot of exciting things are in the pipeline. You can already see some in their webpage. And for me, I thank you so much for being with us, and have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend, and see you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you
so much, Lisa. And all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.